Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney. I'm here with Dr. Nathan French. And today we are talking about Deuteronomy 32, a song that God taught Moses, and it has a really fascinating line about the spiritual realm. We're going to talk about this fantastic piece of biblical Hebrew poetry. It's going to be a lot of fun. Dr. French, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, yes. Very happy to be here again.
So the book of Deuteronomy, this was actually a book that, look, whenever I talk about engaging the Hebrew Bible when I was younger, Proverbs was my go-to because it was very straightforward and direct.
Yeah.
Normally, I lived in the New Testament because it was a lot more familiar. It was a lot easier to read, and particularly the Gospels and Paul's easier letters. And because of that, I actually kind of liked part of Deuteronomy because to me, it reads a little bit like Paul, where it's a lot of direct speech.
Mm-hmm.
Here I am speaking to you. And so not like I understood the whole book by any means, but I thought it was a little easier to track than, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah or some of these other books.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I don't know what your initial thoughts were in Deuteronomy.
Well, I mean, initial thoughts, I don't know, but what I loved as I became a more serious student of Scripture, was Deuteronomos, right? Second Torah, second law that we have here with Deuteronomy, and realizing that we have Moses retelling the next generation, essentially, all about the law and the Torah that came a generation previously. And so it's such an interesting text because it in fact is reinterpreting so much of what had come in Exodus, and providing that content to a new generation, and doing it in the way that it does it, like you've already mentioned, I think is great. Also, one other piece too that I like with my students to point out is that, of course, as you move out into the rest of the historical books, as you move out into what's called the former prophets, or the historical books, beyond even in many of the prophets, a lot of them are obviously looking back to Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy is sort of the theme, the text that's running through all of those texts when it comes to how Israel is or is not being faithful to the Lord. And so it just becomes one of those central texts, and is so even into the New Testament. I always like quoting Deuteronomy, 6, 4, and 5. Of course, you have, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, or the Lord only. And then, of course, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, of course, Deuteronomy is very important for all generations moving forward.
Yeah, that's really good, because one of the most famous lines of all of Scripture is there, that Deuteronomy 6:4 and Deuteronomy 6:4 through 5. So it has one of the most important verses. Jesus is quoting that when he describes what one of the greatest commandments is. And you also mention how this Deuteronomy plays a big role in everything moving forward, to the point that when you read academic literature on some of the historical books, you'll hear people talk about the Deuteronomist, or the Deuteronomist historian, this idea that Deuteronomy is so connected to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, to where you see this very, very unified purpose, very unified themes that stretch all the way through.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really helpful orienting lens to read all that through.
Yeah.
And and just knowing this is the second giving of the law by Moses to a new generation, there's a lot to unpack there. I think in a big picture sense, this is just another way of showing that this covenant was not just between God and one generation, but that this is meant to be ongoing. So this is obviously with that generation and with those that follow. So that's really cool. People might be interested in some of the like you mentioned, the reinterpretation of the law. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty of that today, but if anyone who reads any of the corresponding laws closely will notice that there are differences, that not everything is given in the same way. One fun example is the one of the commandments about the Sabbath. Why do we observe the Sabbath? In Exodus, the reason that you do is because God created everything in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. Whereas in Deuteronomy, you rest on the Sabbath because God is the one who saved you from Egypt. And so it's just interesting to reflect on why would there be one reason in Exodus, and why would Moses give a different reason in the second one? And that's just one
Yeah.
example, and there are many to reflect on. Are there any of the reinterpretations you want to touch on brief before we dive
No,
into other things
I
today?
like that one. I think that's a great example because it just goes to show how much of these texts are reinterpreted over and over and again in ancient Israel's history, but also then even as you move forward into the New Testament, challenges on Sabbath, say for Jesus and for the disciples as well. You just see that the taking of the law and the Torah and the interpretation of it and the reinterpretation for each generation is something that is very important, I think, for all generations to consider and to know. And of course, we do this. We do this all the time, even in our own systems of law. There is always the question of a reinterpretation of a text of a
Yeah.
law. Does it fit a new generation? Does it not? Does it need to be reformed? How are we to understand how those of the past understood it? Take the Constitution, for example. Lots of talks about what the Constitution means. It's very similar in this way. You have a text, it has to be interpreted, and it has to be reinterpreted as well. So, um,
In fact, Jesus is probably the best example of this. Matthew 19, a conversation about divorce with Pharisees,
yeah,
and
I
they
love that.
they they bring up a line from Deuteronomy,
Yeah,
to which Jesus says, not so fast. Let's go to Genesis.
yeah. In fact, Jesus will even take it so far as to say, Moses allowed this because of the hardness of your hearts, right? He says,
Yeah.
but in the beginning, this was not so. So, just like you're saying, Jesus actually pushes back against what was a conservative position of the law and the Torah and the reading of it, reinterprets it, and says, it was really only because of human rebellion that was allowed.
Hmm.
The hardness of your hearts, he says to that generation. But in the beginning, it was not supposed to be this way, right? So that is interesting to see how Jesus is challenging the legal tradition, but reestablishing it with even a more conservative view by going back to creation itself.
Let's talk about the big picture of the book of Deuteronomy before we dive into chapter 32. It is so important to understand the context of any verse or chapter that we're reading. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can do that with the
Mm-hmm.
literature, what's going on with the book, the
Mm-hmm.
history, what's going on with Israel's neighbors that's relating to this, either this genre or this historical time period. And of course, what's happening in Hebrew. So we'll tackle all of those things. And then we'll talk about some interesting things within Deuteronomy chapter 32.
Mm-hmm.
So, first, just a brief overview. Dr. French already mentioned, I think, one of the important things, which is that this is the second giving of the law. This is happening to a new generation. This generation did not experience the story of Exodus. And I think that's really important to understand. We've had a number of years pass. So, these are new people group, and they need to know the stories of what's happened. In fact, that's how Deuteronomy begins.
Yeah.
Moses is retelling the history of things that happened. And if you read through the Bible quickly, you might not feel like you need that review. Or maybe if you're like most of us, you would just forget stuff. Oh, I'm so thankful. Thank you, Moses, for giving me a Cliff Notes version of what happened before. But there's a biblically intentional reason for this, that Moses wants to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. So we have this historical preamble about how God saved them. Then we
Mm.
have the second giving of these laws, a lot of reinterpretation.
Mm.
Um, so what's the focus of this text as a whole? I'd be curious how you would frame this. I guess the simplest way, if I had to boil it down, the simplest way possible, this is a book trying to get a new generation of people to commit themselves to Yahweh, to be
Mm.
faithful to the Lord.
Yeah,
That's what this book is ultimately
it's
all
good.
about.
Yeah,
And there are a number of ways that it does that throughout the text.
yeah.
Uh, what thoughts on the overview of Deuteronomy do you have?
No, it's very good. I mean, I agree with you on that. I think at the very core that is what it is. I think too, for me, I have to take it to a historical level, right? So for me, it really is, in
Mhm.
fact, one of these documents. It's a treaty covenant document, which I know we'll talk about here at greater length. But
Yeah.
and because it's a treaty or a covenantal document, to me, it feels a lot, like I said, like a constitution, for example, a
Mm.
text that 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 binds a people together in a governmental system, and that is essentially what Deuteronomy is doing. Now, very interesting. We don't have in the ancient world texts in which gods make a treaty or a covenant with one particular nation, other than what we have here in Deuteronomy. Pretty sure it's true. I have a footnote somewhere in my mind here where we could quote that. But if anyone knows of anything different, you could tell me. But from what I know, I don't think that we have anything else in the ancient Near East but Deuteronomy, where it is in fact this longer treaty covenantal document in which a god makes this covenant with an entire nation. And in that sense, it is, though, the thing that allows the people of God to, in fact, be the people of the Lord. And it gives them the direction of how to do it. But more so, it's as if you can get the text inside you, you can do it, right? You can be the people that God aspires for you to be, this sort of thing. So for me, I see it very much in that way: treaty, covenant.
Let's just go there
you know.
then. I think
Sure.
this is
Yeah.
this is so helpful. This is something that this is probably one of the best examples of I could be in a group with any of you listeners. We could read Deuteronomy 1,000 times, 1,000 times, and we would still not see something very important without having an understanding of ancient Near Eastern texts.
Yeah.
And what will we not understand is the genre that Deuteronomy is. So let me be very clear before we dive into this. I think it's still obvious from without any understanding of the genre of Deuteronomy that this is a document, that a text that's trying to get a new generation to be committed to Yahweh, right? To actually be faithful to the Lord. That's still clear either way.
Right.
But man, there's a different level that gets unlocked when we compare Deuteronomy to others.
Yes.
So I'll give a quick analogy, and then I want to hit it back to you to kind of break this down for us.
Yeah.
This again is similar to how I grew up watching black and white TV, especially Westerns. And because I've seen so many, I understand the genre.
Yeah.
But to understand genre, you have to have seen more than one example of it. Otherwise, you don't even realize it is a genre.
Right.
So if you only know one country song, you don't know what country is. But the more you hear, you're like, oh, they keep singing about the exact same topics. They have like 3 topics that they cycle through,
I know, but the songs are so good. You just got to keep listening.
So I think a lot of people would be really interested to know that the book of Deuteronomy fits very neatly into a genre that's well known in the ancient Near East.
Yeah. Yeah. And that genre is just the genre of treaties and covenants. And we have them all over the place, from the earliest of times, mid-3rd millennium BCE, all the way down and past, right about the 1st millennium BCE. But and we have a lot of them. I mean, they're all over the place, and Deuteronomy is no exception. So it is a part of this tradition of the ancient Near East. And it's important, I think, to know it. Like you said, you can read Deuteronomy and get the sense that that's what you're dealing with, but not until you actually study the ancient Near Eastern other covenants and treaties that we have and actually look at their form, you begin to realize that there is a structure and a form, a genre, if you will, a form to the text itself. And Deuteronomy is very much within that particular form. Interestingly, I think it's important to say that Deuteronomy, in fact, is very much in line with the Hittite suzerain vassal treaties that we have from the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE. So really roughly between about 1600 to about 1250 BCE. Maybe beyond that a little bit. Obviously, we have 1150 BCE when the ancient Near East goes dark. But the Hittite suzerain vassal treaties during that time, Deuteronomy is very much in that same similar structure. And of course,
which is interesting.
Right?
Because that is approximately the time that the story is relating to Moses would have happened.
Right. And of course, Egypt would have been corresponding very much with the Hittites. And of course, if there are any like Hebrew Bible scholars listening to this of certain bents, right? There's great debate about whether or not Moses even existed. Great debate about whether or not Deuteronomy was written in the 6th century BCE or right before the exile or after the exile. There are a lot of scholars who push this. So we're talking dates between the time of Moses to all the way to Josiah and beyond, right at the pre-exilic time or the exilic time itself, claims that this is when Deuteronomy was written. Well, here's the problem. Deuteronomy is very much in the same structure as the Hittite, Suzerain vassal treaties. And we all know the Hittites disappear at the time that the ancient Near East goes dark. So it is quite interesting. It's very interesting that Deuteronomy is in this form. It means that this core definitely is being passed on from a very ancient time. I believe that as a scholar, very much coming down, most likely from the time of Moses. It makes the most sense with the sort of correspondence that would have been going on between Egypt and the Hittites in the way that these treaties and covenants were being written. But that being said, the tradition of treaties and covenants within the ancient Near East, as I've already noted, goes all the way back to 3,500. I mean, to the third millennium BCE. So it's not as if that tradition just existed during that time. This is a long tradition, thousands of years of these treaties, and so they have a structure. And the structure that we have in these, we have the preamble, which you mentioned. We have the historical prologue, which talks about the relationship between the parties. You have stipulations to the main treaty, witnesses to the treaty, which we'll talk about in Deuteronomy 32 actually a little bit, and then we have sort of a document clause and blessings and curses, right, that come at the end of the document. And there are other structures to this as well, different parts of these treaties that exist, but the basic form is there across the millennia in the ancient Near East. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less as far as the structure and the form is concerned. But the point is that Deuteronomy has all of that contained within it as a larger text, and it's important to know that. By the way, Kenneth Kitchen, the great scholar in this particular area, right? He's written on treaty law and covenant, has a great text out there with Paul Lawrence as well. He will show how that form, progresses or evolves from the earliest of times to the latest of times within the ancient Near East, and shows quite clearly how Deuteronomy, and even in his belief, how Exodus and Leviticus as being in that form actually fits quite well with the treaty structures of the ancient Near East. So very, very interesting and very important to know, actually. So
Yeah, I mean, this is huge. And this is research that's only been done for about the last, what would you guess, about 200-ish years since these have been discovered,
since these
right?
texts have been discovered, right? And I mean, this type of genre criticism, form criticism was really popular, of course, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s especially. Then the students of that era, George Mendenhall really in the 70s was one who really put forth a lot of the arguments with regard to the Hittite vassal treaties. He'll say it, even the Anchor Bible Dictionary, I believe, his article will actually suggest those connections and then make other connections of updates that would have happened probably later in Israel's history during the Neo Assyrian time, because, of course, there were treaties being written during that time, with Esarhaddon's vassal treaty, for example, in the 7th century BCE. So 700 years between what we're, well, even more potentially, 800 years, 900 years between what we're talking about with regard to the time of Moses and the Hittite, Suzerain vassal treaties in Deuteronomy and the Neo Assyrian treaties. But of course, Israel is existing in its story during those times, and the claim of Deuteronomy exists within that time as well. So you can imagine that there would be updates along the way as well, happening within that particular text. So,
Which goes back to what we started with earlier, that Deuteronomy itself includes reinterpretation of the law as given from Exodus, because we have a new generation.
yeah,
So it would not be doing a disservice to the heart of the message
no,
to continue to, in a way, update this text as we go along.
yeah,
In
yeah,
fact, you'll read some scholars will note that, some scholars take a stance on this, that Deuteronomy is totally like the Hittite suzerain vassal treaties
mm-hmm.
of the second millennium, whereas others will say it's only first millennium. You have others who would say maybe it's actually a little bit of both, that there's a core
Yeah,
from the second millennium, but that there are some stylistic or creative changes, like potentially like the very long curse section in Deuteronomy later on,
Mm-hmm.
and be like, hey, what will be the purpose of that? And you think that Deuteronomy is a message that didn't just matter to the generation it was originally spoken to and then collects dust for a while. This is a message that's relevant to new generations. And if the goal of the text is still the same, to get a new generation to commit themselves to Yahweh, to actually be faithful to the Lord, then you want to package that message in a way where it resonates like that. And not only that, but if Deuteronomy itself is truly this is a treaty, this is a covenant, this isn't just a narrative story, this isn't just a collection of laws for reference material, then maybe there's reason that they would start to mold the shape of this book like
Mm.
the other treaties that
Mm.
the people of Israel are seeing around these days,
Yeah.
and it makes sure it's really clear. So anyway, those are the three main positions you'll see. Either
Yeah, it's
this
good.
is totally
It's a good overview. Yeah.
Hittite,
Yeah.
or it's totally Assyrian. And the
Yeah.
reason that would matter for people coming to Scripture is its origin, around the time when the historical Moses would have existed. Is this totally, much later
Yeah.
creation around 700 BCE, or a mixture of the two?
Yeah, and I think I think the best option as a scholar, I will say this. I think the best option, and I'm sure you agree with me also in your own scholarship here. So I think the best conclusion that we can make is that it definitely is both and, right? That you have
Mhm.
what has come down, and you're going to have the updates that happen, obviously, as you move on with any sort of text like this, that is in fact a legal text, is a treaty in this sense. It's like I was saying earlier, and though the comparison is anachronistic, the comparison still works, I think, on every level. Even in modern Hebrew, the United States is called Arzot Habarit, right?
Mhm.
The lands of the covenant, right? Because we have individual autonomous states that are bound together by the U.S. Constitution. It's a text, the very core of American life. So you would think of, we even do it today. We say, well, you want to know your rights, you got to have your Constitution, know what the amendments are. But even today, it is a text that has to be interpreted by people that we've elected to do that interpretation, right? And this becomes very similar, I think, to what we have in Deuteronomy, though the revelation is, in fact, from the Lord through Moses. You even get Jesus, for example, pushing back and saying, well, Moses allows it, but this isn't the way it was in the very beginning, right? So you can see how a text would be in flux. So I love the way that you have framed that. I think that's very useful. I might use that in the classroom, that this is for every generation, and that's just so important. That as the text moves forward, as the story moves forward, we see that Deuteronomy asks itself, it makes the claim within itself that it is for every generation within Israel to come. And so for that reason, it gets reinterpreted in various
Yeah.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree. It's just built.
Yeah.
It's just built right in. But
Yeah.
look, I know depending on someone's background, this could just be very uncomfortable. And I think it's helpful to understand, again, what's the heart of the book? What's the goal?
Yeah.
And reinterpreted. But there are certain ideas within Deuteronomy that aren't just. It's not like everything is just getting changed. Like this started as a pizza and now it came out the oven as a peanut butter and jelly
No.
sandwich.
No.
Like,
No. No. No.
you know what I mean? Like this is still a treaty,
Yeah.
and this is still a treaty between Yahweh and Israel.
Yeah.
And it's specifically one that, again, it's in the form of a suzerain vassal treaty.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the powerful side,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, and then the other side that's subservient to that. So you have Yahweh as presented as this king, you could
Mm-hmm.
say, and Israel as his people, his nation, and commitment and loyalty to him throughout the generations, even as things change
Yeah.
over time.
But on that note, we could even stress it here. It's been talked about that the word for love in the ancient Near Eastern treaties occurs often, and it does mean something like loyalty, if you will. So, for example, which I mean makes sense. I mean that's how we understand love in the deepest sense of the word, as we would use it. I think in our modern ways when you think about marriage and you think about all sorts of things. But um, you have at this particular core within the ancient Near Eastern treaties this word that means something like loyalty and faithfulness. So you'd have, just as an example, you might have a Hittite king who comes to his vassal in the land of Canaan. They have a treaty, they're in covenant, and the Hittite king would say to the disobedient vassal, "You have not loved me." Right? You have not been loyal to me. And that is the language that would be used in these treaties. We know this from reading the other Akkadian treaties that we have, right? Or the other Hittite treaties or documents that we have from the ancient Near East. And what you find is right here. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? So you should be loyal to him. Even Jesus will say it, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, right? I mean, Jesus will
say the
take
same thing.
Exactly. So
Yep.
he'll take the same understanding from this ancient text and really amplify it for his own generation and what it actually is referring to, what it really means. So anyways, on that note, I think what I'm saying with that is it is important that we understand the historical aspect of these texts, understand the structure, why it was maybe structured in that particular way. But it does matter for the very words that we have. Like, we need to get to interpretation, and the only way to do that is to understand time and to understand history and to look at the way words are being used in those contexts in order for us to be able to interpret it correctly. So you're absolutely right. With regard to interpretation, we're not suggesting that it is like a pizza and it just showed up in the way that it does, or it is unimportant. No, rather, why do we have longer curses, and why is that similar to the Neo Assyrian Esarhaddon on vassal treaties? Right, these sorts of questions that you would have. So,
yeah, that's so good. So I guess if there's just one takeaway, and I had to really simplify it about what we're saying in this historical section is if you want to say Deuteronomy is a book, right? A book of the Bible.
Yeah.
Add this sentence: Deuteronomy is a treaty. Yeah. Or even better, it's an ancient Near Eastern treaty.
Yeah, it's good.
Keep that in the back of your mind. And for those of you that want to dig deeper, I'll put links in the show notes below to Dr. French mentioned Kenneth Kitchen. I'll reference a couple of resources for those of you that want to dig deeper. There are articles that we can find that are just more general, or they're the ones that go really deep into this. But if you engage with this idea of the genre of Deuteronomy, you will get more out of it. I want to make one other comment on something you said that I thought was so good about, not to bring up a music reference, but what is love? What is love? Baby, don't hurt me.
Yes, indeed.
They said it Rickroll, everybody. But I think it's so helpful when you mention the way that the word love is used in these other ancient Near Eastern treaties. The more times we see that come up in a concrete social interaction, we see, I understand what's going on. You didn't love me. This idea is you weren't loyal to me.
Yeah.
And I think that idea is so helpful for understanding Deuteronomy and understanding the nature of our relationship with God. Because again, Deuteronomy 6:5, and you will love the Lord your God. So what does this look like? Again, what is love? Not to be a philosopher or a bad singer, but I think it's really clarifying to understand that any idea of love that is not including loyalty is not getting the whole picture.
That's
As
right.
Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commands.
Yeah.
That this means that love really does involve action. Action that is rooted in faithfulness, and it's type of action where we are doing things to preserve that relationship, so that relationship will thrive. Things for that other person that are good, things that they desire, things that they want. So anyway, I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, no, it's very good. Very good.
That's some overview thoughts about Deuteronomy as a whole. We're going to dive into Deuteronomy chapter 32. And let's segue this way. Let's do one last bit on the treaty form, because Deuteronomy 32 appears in the section that is these ancient Near Eastern treaties. They would have a section that basically would be something like, hey, every X number of years, make sure everyone gathers here and reads this treaty. So they would often put the treaty, let's say, at the temple. So the suzerain, would be the leading party in the treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's like the Hittites, really powerful, and then people that they're ruling, they would receive a copy of this treaty. They'd put it inside the temple where their deity is, and basically say that your deity is going to be a witness of, and my deities, right? They're all witnesses to this. And every X number of years, get the leaders of your people and read this treaty again. And it has the whole story, right? It has the preamble, it has the historical prologue. Why do we have this relationship?
Mm-hmm.
And the stipulations that we're going to do. So Deuteronomy 32 fits in that section. In fact, I would even say that Deuteronomy 32 is another example of a really unfortunate chapter placement, because it really belongs with chapter 31. In fact, if you read the previous verse, it's talking about the song, and then it like chapter end, go to the rest of the song. But if you read Deuteronomy chapter 31, you hear about how God talks about, hey, keep these texts of the of this book, and every 7 years get all the people to read them. And then there's this song that God is going to teach Moses, and this song, God says, is going to act as a testimony, as a witness against the people who he knows inevitably will be unfaithful to him.
Mm.
So this song is it's kind of like, okay, I don't know why this picture just came to my mind. You could almost view this as a whole church service, I guess you could say, where where you have a sermon, if you will, and that's the text of the treaty, and then say, hey, let's add a song onto this ceremony too. So every 7 years you'll have a song and a reading of the text. So that's kind of the role that this part plays.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 31. God says, now therefore write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them, and despise me and break my covenant. And when many evils and troubles have come upon them, this song shall comfort them as a witness, for it will live unforgotten in the mouths of their offspring. For I know what they are inclined to do even today, before I have brought them into the land that I swore to give them. So Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the people of Israel. We get a few other sections, and then we get this song. Let's see, verse 30 says, then Moses spoke the words of the song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly of Israel. Then you get Deuteronomy 32. I read that because it's important to know the purpose of this song, and it helps us understand some of the tone that this particular song has. Let's see. Do you have any thoughts on this song before? I know there's some Hebrew stuff I wanted to talk about. We have a lot of specific things here. I feel like I've been talking a little bit. Let me just, how I switch to you. Do you have any thoughts on Deuteronomy 32
Well,
that
no,
we
I've
want to dive
enjoyed
in?
what you're saying. This has been very good. So, no, I don't have anything. I'll just affirm everything you were saying, but definitely this witness aspect, this calling the heavens, for example, to be a witness
Yes.
against Israel, and this is actually very important because, again, at the very heart of what's happening here is a I hate the word relationship, but that's the word that we're using here, right? At the very core, I just feel like the word's so overused within Christian
Sure.
land. But here,
Sure.
a relationship is being formed, obviously, between the Lord and between the people of Israel. And the covenant is the thing that is doing it, but there are going to be witnesses within this legal structure that is here. Like this is a very much a legal structure that has been formed between Israel and between Yahweh, and all sorts of parties here are involved in bearing witness to this agreement that has been made. And what I do love about this is it does hearken us back to the Song of the Sea, right? To Exodus 15, where such a pivotal moment within that whole narrative, especially if you think of Exodus and Leviticus like a treaty structure. As Kenneth Kitchen has argued, though, over and against all of Hebrew Bible scholarship, nevertheless, very interesting to make that argument. We have at the very core of that the Song of the Sea. Similar here with Deuteronomy 32, though different in many respects. I just find it interesting that you have the sea, or I'm sorry, the song that comes forth, even in the midst of this treaty structure, if you will. So,
Yeah, so Deuteronomy 32, honestly, this deserves a whole Bible study episode from us. So we could go line by line through this text. It's fascinating. We don't have time in this episode to do that. But just to give you a little taste, the way it begins, as Nathan just mentioned here, give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. So heaven and earth are being called to witness, and Israel is the focus. And he says, may my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. So many verses here. We don't have time to dig into all of them, like I already mentioned. But I do want to talk about, I think, a few really interesting Hebrew language insights from this chapter. The first one, I'll just briefly say, this is one of the few examples of what scholars call archaic biblical Hebrew that we have in the Bible. This basically amounts to being a lot of the poetry sections of the Torah and the former prophets, but certain poems are especially archaic. They maintain a lot of the older forms, and this is one of them. You have the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5. You have the blessing of Jacob in Genesis 40 or in Genesis 49. We also have this one in 32. There are a few others. So that's already cool. So whenever people are the original audience, well, as we've learned already, there's many original audiences throughout the generation, throughout the time of the Deuteronomy and its usage throughout the history of Israel. But as people get to this section, this doesn't read the same like everything else that they hear. Maybe an overly simple analogy would be anytime if you start reading a text where it has thee and thou in it, it doesn't feel like this was written yesterday. So it gives a bit of a seasoning that this is something that's older. And I think there's a cool effect that this has even in relation to this covenant. So even as this is being updated for every generation, there's still a quality of it that harkens back to days of old. All right, now really the main Hebrew insights that I wanted to say is we have a few words in here that are very rare, and I think it's very telling why these words are used. So we're going to hop to Genesis chapter 1 real quick. And Genesis 1 verse 2, we have two words of note. We have the word tohu and then the word merachefet. So tohu, translated so many ways in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, and it's been talked about quite endlessly about what does it mean. But this is the sentence in ESV that says the earth was without form and void. Robert Alter famously did tohu and vohu as wild and waste. But this is describing the state of the earth before God speaks and brings order in the Genesis 1 creation account. So that word tohu is used there. And then the other word we're looking at is merachefet. So the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That word hovering and the earlier word before, both of those words only appear twice in the whole Torah. And guess where they appear? Genesis 1 verse 2 and in our song Deuteronomy 32. So what does it say in Deuteronomy 32? It's in verse 10, and we have that God is describing part of his, to use your favorite word, Nathan, relationship with Israel. In the previous couple verses, he talks about how we might get into this more later, but how God is their father, how, he created them. Here in 32 verse 10 in Deuteronomy, we have, he being Yahweh, found him, Israel, in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness. That word waste is the same word as form in Genesis 1:2, tohu, in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young. That word for flutters is that same Hebrew verb that's hover in Genesis 1:2. Here it's the form yerachef. This is a verb, so it's conjugated. That flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. Okay, so basically we have two rare words only that both only appear twice in the Torah, in a creation story and here in Deuteronomy 32. What's the point? This is clearly eliciting creation language. And Israel is being compared to, however you want to describe the status of the earth before God brings order. There's obviously a lot of metaphorical imagery here because we get hovering over the face of the deep. So we have the word tohu often describes deserts, yet this deserty place is also really watery. But anyway, however you look at it, we have that the scene before God brings order and life to everything in Genesis, that's the same state that Israel was in before he got a hold of them. So we have a picture of God as this great, awesome creator who finds Israel in a state that was not at all conducive for them to have life or flourishing. And this is the people that he has chosen to be his own. So
excellent. Yeah.
So this will fit into our ongoing conversation, but that's enough to at least catch a couple Hebrew things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. Again, I would love for everyone to compare. What does your translation? How does your favorite translation do Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32:10 through 11? How does it do those words? The ESV is what I have pulled up here. We have form and waste, hovering and flutters. If you're reading that in English, you would never have guessed it's the same Hebrew word.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about some of the other stuff. You go ahead and.
Well, I think that's very good. I'm glad you brought all that up because it's very interesting that we get here when we're talking about the covenants and the treaties. Because obviously, within the wider ancient Near East, you do have the land and you have the heavens. Like they have to give witness. The mountains, they give witness to the treaties as well. Like they're part of the witness structure. And though we have that here. The interesting thing, though, is the uniqueness of this connection back to Genesis 1, because, you have, give ear, O heavens, ha'azinu hashamayim, and I will speak. And then you have v'tishma ha'aretz, let the earth hear, right? The words that he's going to utter, the imrei fi. So, and even with tishma, you could think, does the land have to obey? You sort of get that understanding when God speaks in Genesis 1, creation does what he says. I often think that that's sort of an interesting, I was reading in Modern Hebrew one time, the New Testament story when I was living in Jerusalem with Jesus calming the storm. And he speaks and it says that, everything goes still, right? The wind and the seas do what he says. And then the disciples are astonished at the wind and the seas. But then in Modern Hebrew, it said that they obeyed him using Shema as the root. Yeah. And it's very, it's very interesting to see that there because it's referring to obedience, right? Referring to doing what he says. The creation will listen to him, but the humans there are quite astonished. They are still trying to decide whether or not they're going to obey him. But on another note, we have it.
Hold on. This is good what you're bringing up, though. I feel like we can't not make this connection. This goes back to early Deuteronomy where we have Shema appearing many times.
That's right.
Referring to this obedience, just like the famous, the Shema. It's called the Shema because it starts with Shema Israel, right? Listen, often the fact it's translated here is really unfortunate. It's like, oh, the sound, Lord, your sound waves technically went into one ear and bounced around in my head. No, like this is Shema that often has that connotation.
That's good.
Not just paying attention, but a response. And that response, of course, is obedience. So you could say that In a way, you could summarize the whole book of Deuteronomy as Shema if you want.
There you go.
This word is very intentional. Sorry to cut
No,
you off, but I
no,
thought
it's
that
great.
was
No, it's very good because
important.
it actually fits quite well, even with the story from the New Testament that I'm referring to. But even
Mm,
here, you can see how this imagery just spans all of ancient Israel's history. This idea that creation itself does what the Lord says. And of course, God speaking in the ancient Near East is very much part of the wider culture. But you see it here within these texts. It's very important with the roots that are being used. And he doesn't have to I don't know, hold creation to a treaty or a covenant, right? They're just going to
yeah.
do what he says when he says to do it. And that's sort of the point I'm wanting to make, that
Mm,
it's interesting that all of this is definitely part of the treaty tradition. But here, when we get to Deuteronomy 32, you, and I know we're going to move through this even more, you start to get the sense like this is more like Mati's favorite book growing up. This is more like Proverbs, right?
mm,
Yeah, you sort of are getting okay, listen to my voice, do what I say, because
yeah.
what I'm going to say is wisdom, and you're going to need this essentially, right, to do
Yeah.
to do what is needed. So
That's really good. You're right. There's a line in Deuteronomy. I forget where. I didn't have this prepared today, but that this is your wisdom.
essentially what we have here are the words of Yahweh coming forth, and to trust them and to take the risk that it takes to trust them, because it is risky to trust the words of Yahweh.
Mm.
That would be faith, right? I mean, that ultimately is faith that we would be referring to from an ancient
Break that
perspective.
down more for me. What do you mean that it would be
Well,
risky to?
because, well, I mean, take well, it's risky to trust Yahweh. I mean, take Moses for example. Here's the burning bush telling him to go do what he wants to do, and he says, "No, I'm not doing that. It's too risky. I'm not going to go to. You want me to go back to Egypt and to tell? What if they don't believe me? Who do I say sent to me? And it all comes down to Aaron being the one that's going to go really and speak on behalf of Yahweh ultimately. So the point is, like, there's great risk when Yahweh shows up and starts speaking, and depending upon how you respond to that risk, it, you're either going to believe it, you're going to trust him, or you're not. See, I think in the modern world we've said that faith is believing in things that are unreasonable, but in the ancient world that's not what they understood it as. No, you trust the words that are being spoken to you from the one who is speaking them. But there's great risk with it. We'll just go right to the New Testament. I think Jesus is great with it, right? He tells the rich man, one thing, sell all that you have, give alms to the poor, come and follow me, and you'll have great treasure in heaven, right? The man goes away sad. Why? It's too risky. He can't sell it all. That's
Mm,
just too much risk that's required. Or
mm,
he who seeks to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Well, that is risky. You got to lose your life if you want to find it. So I think the point with that is that at the very core of what it means to be living by faith is this element of risk.
mm.
And either you're going to trust Yahweh in the midst of that risk or not. And that determines whether or not you're actually walking by faith.
Mm. That's so interesting. I've never heard that vocabulary used, but I'm really fascinated, and that's a fresh way to present this idea of faith by talking about the risk
Yeah.
that
Well,
that's involved with that, and
that's life
takes
for you.
risk. That's
Well,
great.
it's risky for Abraham to leave his father
Yeah,
and all that he knows and go to the land that God will show him. He hasn't shown him yet.
yeah.
He has to go to the land he will show him. So, anyway, so that's good.
Okay, let's just read a little bit more of Deuteronomy 32. There's one last thing we want to touch on. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children, because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Remember, this is a song written for the future that God knows is going to happen, that people inevitably will be unfaithful to him. Okay, so that's how this verse makes sense. Verse 6, do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you? Wow. I've heard people say that God has never described his father into the New Testament. But lo and behold, here
There
we
it
are.
is.
And not just anywhere in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible. This is in a really pivotal position as
Yeah.
God is their father.
Yeah. Yeah. So important, actually, this idea of God as Father within ancient Israel, because it goes back to the whole creation. I mean, even the New Testament writers will do that with the genealogy of Jesus, right? Talking about Adam as the son of God. So you have that element there. You have the B'nai Elohim that appear in Genesis 6. So obviously God has divine sons, has his divine assembly, his divine council. So that language is there. But more importantly, like, you just miss the entire story of Genesis if you don't think about God as Father, because you've got Abraham and Sarah. And who is the one who brings about the miracle for the son that's going to be born? It is the Lord himself. He actually comes and talks to Abraham and says he's going to visit Sarah and cause this amazing thing to happen in their old age. And so Isaac becomes the promised child, but there is a sense in which God had a part to play in this. And of course, by the time Isaac has his own children, Jacob, who's going to be renamed Israel, we're going to find that he, in fact, is the firstborn son of God, right? So Israel is God's firstborn son in Exodus 4:22. That's what the Lord says to Moses, who is to say to Pharaoh that Israel is my firstborn son. Because you won't let my firstborn son go, I'm going to kill all the firstborn of Egypt. So that whole retributive thing that's happening there. But the whole point and reason is because Israel is God's firstborn son. He is father to Israel. And you see it right here in Deuteronomy 32. That is the whole point, that God is the one who kanecha. So you have this root kane. We could bring up, for example, Genesis 4:1, where you have Eve who brings forth Cain. And it says
Yep.
that with the help of Yahweh, with the help of Adonai, Hashem, that she brings forth Cain, but the root that is used is Kaneh, right? Or Kana, sorry. And
Yep.
interesting, we know from the Ugaritic texts that we have that this particular root could mean acquire, which it usually does within the Hebrew Bible, acquire, obtain. But from the Ugaritic text, we know that it can mean create. It can mean to build, something to that effect. In fact, we had that in the first verse, did we not? Or was it a different verse of Deuteronomy 32?
We did have it in 32.
It's in 32 elsewhere regarding maker of the heavens, creator of the heavens. It's okay, I forget where it's at. But in any case, to know that the root is being used both to show that God is creator, but then that he is the one who creates Israel as his son, his firstborn son, is essential to knowing the whole rest of the story. So we know here that it isn't just, and this is what's beautiful about Deuteronomy 32 and why I was bringing up Proverbs. It's not just greater overlord, suzerain, the suzerain, and then the vassal, the lesser of the party. It's father and son. And this is why the proverbial language is quite interesting here, and other ancient Near Eastern wisdom tradition texts that we have that would fit this model as well. So you have this blending of the suzerain, vassal, and the father and the son. And I don't know. I mean, I guess that makes sense on many levels when you're using language of love between a suzerain and a vassal. I mean, it feels a lot like a father and a son, I suppose, on some levels. So, but interesting here, God is the one who is father of Israel. He created them. And this is what Deuteronomy 32 is really pointing to.
Yeah, it's loaded. It's loaded. And while you could say there's some overlap with, maybe a father-son to a suzerain vassal relationship, ultimately, the more that we read of scripture, we see there's a reason that many, many metaphors and analogies are used to describe our relationship with God, because they're so multifaceted.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And Deuteronomy 32 is very full of these. And obviously God as Father is one of those that it totally touches on. And this is just an important expression of the character of God. in general.
And
And
essential to know, I think, for everyone, especially from a New Testament perspective. Like you said, someone once said that God is not known as Father till the New Testament. But the reason why the New Testament even goes there is because the Hebrew Bible is already there. Like, it is the story. It is at the very
yeah,
heart of what it
yeah,
means to be Israel. You are God's firstborn son.
yes,
And that is going to become very important for Deuteronomy 32:8, which we have not talked about, but we will do a whole episode on that. It's actually quite essential.
yeah. There's just not enough time to get into it. I mean, I think we're gonna have to table that, and we're just gonna call it a great cliffhanger,
Yes.
like The Empire Strikes Back. I am your father. Um,
That's a
anyway, that
great
was a pretty.
example, actually. So,
So we'll do that. As always, thanks to everyone who listens. Share this with anyone that you think this would add value to. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. And thank you to all of you who support us on Patreon. We'll see you all in the next episode.